Buoyed by the belief, a belief held by him, but also others, that he brought peace to the Middle East, President Trump is trying yet again to end Russia's war on Ukraine. But here at home, he's waging war on his domestic critics, engaging in a prosecution campaign without precedent in American history. Next.
This is Washington Week with The Atlantic. Corporate funding provided by Consumer Cellular.
Certified financial planner professionals are proud to support Washington Week with The Atlantic. CFP professionals are committed to acting in their clients' best interest. More information at letsmakeaplan.org.
Additional funding is provided by Koo and Patricia Ewan through the Ewan Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose Herschel and Andy Shreves, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, Charles Hamawi through the Charles Hamawi Fund, Steve and Marilyn Kerman, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. Once again, from the David M. Rubenstein studio at WETA in Washington, Editor-in-Chief of The Atlantic and moderator, Jeffrey Goldberg.
Good evening and welcome to Washington Week. So it's been one of those weeks. You lose track of the news for 10 minutes and Donald Trump has done something outrageous or unbelievable or remarkable or something unbelievably, remarkably outrageous. We'll talk tonight about his intensifying quest for a Nobel Peace Prize and whether he can bang heads together in Europe the way he just did in the Middle East. And we'll talk about his administration's accelerating campaign at home to excoriate, indict, and or marginalize the president's many enemies, real and imagined. The Justice Department is no longer an autonomous agency, but a weapon in Trump's arsenal, and the Department of Defense, we won't be calling it the Department of War until Congress actually makes that change, has driven the free press out of the Pentagon. Joining me tonight to discuss all this and more, Ann Applebaum, a staff writer at The Atlantic. Stephen Hayes is the editor of The Dispatch. Tyler Pager is a White House correspondent at The New York Times. And Nancy Youssef remains a Pentagon correspondent at The Atlantic.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy, for being here. I know you're not at the Pentagon, but you're still covering the Defense Department
That's right.
rigorously, and we'll talk about that in a little while. But, Ann, I want to start with you. President Zelenskyy back in the White House. Not a great meeting from his perspective, not a disaster like an earlier meeting, but it seems as if we're on this roller coaster with President Trump. First, he was on Putin's side. Then Putin alienated him, and he announced a little while back, maybe Ukraine can take all of its territory back. Now he's back in this mode. He just put this on Truth Social a little while ago. The meeting with President Zelenskyy was very interesting and cordial, but I told him, as I likewise strongly suggested to President Putin, that it is time to stop the killing and make a deal. Enough blood has been shed, with property lines being defined by war and guts. And then he goes on for a while. Now, obviously, if you're President Zelenskyy and you hear him say that it is time to stop the killing, in Zelenskyy's mind, he's saying yes, and the guy who started the killing probably should stop. Give us a sense, from your perspective, of where we are in this drama. Is he getting frustrated or just tired of thinking about Ukraine?
So let me step back a second and let's remember what it would really take to end this war. How would you really end it? None of the drama or imaginary solutions. So what it takes to end the war is to persuade the Russians, President Putin, the Moscow elite, whoever, that it's not worth fighting anymore and that they need to stop. They need to bring their troops home and they need to make a deal. They're the ones who have to be persuaded. And unfortunately, almost everything that President Trump has done since taking office has pushed them in the opposite direction, has encouraged them to keep fighting. So by attacking Zelenskyy back in February, by saying we'll give them Tomahawks, we won't give them Tomahawks, by messing around with sanctions, we'll do sanctions, we won't do sanctions. All of these things are encouraging President Putin to say, right, I can break up the coalition that helps Ukraine. I can separate America from Europe. I can hold out longer than these Americans who can't make up their mind what they want, and I can win. And Putin has never said he wants a ceasefire. He has never recognized the legitimacy of Zelenskyy. He has never said that Ukraine can survive as an independent sovereign state. So until he gives up those things, the war will continue. And so what we're doing now is encouraging him to believe that he can fight.
Steve,
and that's why I think there's a level of disaster here that's not immediately obvious from the optics.
Steve, put this in the context of what he just did in the Middle East, because he did bring the situation to a ceasefire and did force the release of the Israeli hostages. Partially, he did that by bullying, to some degree, Netanyahu, his friend and ally, partially by threatening Hamas. Are there lessons in that for Ukraine and Russia, or is Ukraine and Russia a whole other level of difficulty?
Yeah, I think it's a whole other level of difficulty, and there, as an alliance, an actual alliance between the U.S. and Israel, that there really isn't between the U.S. and Russia right now, even though Donald Trump wants to be on friendly terms with Vladimir Putin. But I think Ann is right. I mean, if you go back and you look at the things that Donald Trump has said, these moments where he's feigned toughness toward Vladimir Putin rhetorically, you have 50 days. There has to be a ceasefire within 50 days. Then he shifted it to 10 to 12 days. Then he threatened very severe consequences shortly before Alaska if they didn't stop the fighting. And at virtually every one of those moments, Vladimir Putin not only disregarded what the president was saying, he stepped up kinetic action in Ukraine, as if to say, I'm not listening to you. What you say to me doesn't matter. And, there was a time when, if you talk to people in sort of Trump world or Trump national security world, they would say they thought there was a chance that Donald Trump would be humiliated by this, embarrassed by this, that Putin was so clearly not taking him seriously, and perhaps actually change his posture. But it seems, and I think today's meeting suggests that that is not, in fact, the case. He had a warm call, by all accounts, with Putin yesterday, or friendly call, and coming out of this meeting with Zelenskyy today, despite Zelenskyy's obsequiousness and flattery in their joint discussion in front of reporters, doesn't sound like the meeting went very well.
One of the reporters he had that moment of flattery was Tyler. You were there. Zelenskyy seems to have learned that flattery works better than honesty. I don't know. You tell us.
Yeah, I mean, there is a clear difference in the way that Zelenskyy is presenting himself in front of Trump than when he did the first time in the Oval Office, and he was basically dismissed, and the
J.D. Vance went after him.
Yeah, and the relationship just sort of blew up from there. I mean, he is disappointed that he did not get the Tomahawks, and I think there was some whiplash there because it seemed prior to...
Explain that just a little bit.
Yeah, prior to, President Trump's call with Putin yesterday, there was an expectation that the U.S. was going to give Ukraine Tomahawks, which it has desperately wanted, to fire these long-range missiles into deeper targets in Russia. Then President Trump has a call with Putin. It's unclear exactly what was said on that call, but clearly he persuaded him to a certain degree to not give Zelenskyy the Tomahawks, and Zelensky's leaving Washington without the Tomahawks. Right. But we did not see that. Zelenskyy was measured and composed outside the White House after the meeting. He reiterated that he similarly, like the president said in this True Social you just read, he wants to end the war. And he was very delicate and careful in his word choice because he knows that he needs to continue to remain on good terms with Trump if he wants any sort of leverage or progress in this.
Nancy, as a Pentagon correspondent, explain the importance of the Tomahawks. That seems to be the acid test here. If you give the Ukraine the Tomahawks, they can do some serious damage. But talk about that a little bit in the context of the situation on the ground.
So Tomahawks are cruise missiles that launch up to over 1,000 miles, and they are harder to detect. So what they would give the Ukrainians is precision and distance. You can launch them from ships, submarines, and more recently from land. And so the idea tactically would be if they had Tomahawk missiles, they could do things like hit Moscow, hit air bases from which drones and some of these attack planes are flying over Ukraine, and also hit some of the military depots that are and factories that are producing the weapons that are posing a threat to Ukraine. Having said that, I think they also pose they are there as a form of leverage. So we think there's what they offer to the potential battlefield, but also what they offer politically. And I think as we think about the use of Tomahawks, we should think of them as the way that the president is trying to put pressure on Putin to potentially enter talks in Budapest down the road. So there's a military value to them, but there's also a political one.
Right, and the Tomahawks would be actual proof that Trump wants Ukraine to win?
They could be. I mean, I don't think at this point in the war there's any single weapon that would be a real game changer. I mean, in fact, the weapons or the weapons system that's made the biggest difference in the war are the ones that have been built by the Ukrainians themselves. So they have completely reinvented
their homemade drone situation.
And homemade drones, if it sounds like they're making them with glue and tape, as we saw at the beginning of the war, this is not the case anymore. These are very, very sophisticated factories. I was there a month ago and saw some of them.
Couple of years ago, Ann and I were in Ukraine, and they were literally doing this in garages.
This is now not like that at all anymore. These are sophisticated. The drones are the size of this table or bigger. They're large little airplanes. They can fly for 7 hours. They carry warheads. They've taken out 20% of the Russian refinery industry already. And so it's not so much what's important about the Tomahawks isn't the weapon and what it can do. I mean, I'm sure they'd be delighted to have them. What's important is the symbolism, you know, the fact that the U.S. is giving a sophisticated weapon to Ukraine, and that would, as I said, that would help bring about the end of the war because it would convince the Russians that actually Ukraine's allies are going to stick with it and actually Ukraine has a lot of staying power.
Right. The president is very confident right now. I want you to listen to what he said on Thursday.
That's all I've done in my whole life. I've made deals. I know about deals. I do it well. I don't think any president's ever ended a war, frankly. One war, I did 8 of them.
So I want to show the viewers at home and you a partial list of wars ended by other presidents. This is a very partial list. You're familiar with many of these, includes, you know, I would throw in the American Revolution as a war ended by George Washington successfully. As you look at that list, Steve, you've studied President Trump for years. Does he believe this, or is this part of his, I will bend reality in order to get the Nobel Peace Prize? Does he believe that he's the only president to ever stop a war?
So I think he convinces himself that he's the only president. But he's not. He doesn't stop and think, wow, wait, is this true? If it's not true, I ought not say it. I mean, I don't think he's ever done that. So he says these things. And in the same breath, and he did this again with Zelenskyy today, he claimed, what is the war count that he's ended now? 8? I think he says 8. Now we're approaching 9.
And sometimes he forgets which countries he's mediated.
Which he's claiming, right. Today he said he saved millions and millions of lives. He's ended 8 wars. No, I think...
Is this advertising for the Nobel Committee?
Well, I doubt it. I mean, I think it's very clear that he's obsessed with winning the Nobel. I mean, everybody who talks to him, everybody who knows him.
Absolutely. I mean, just to add on to that, part of the reason he's obsessed is because Obama won the prize. And he does not feel Obama deserved the prize, and he thinks he deserved the prize. This has been something he's been obsessed with dating back to his first term.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think you might be right about Obama, if I can editorialize a little bit. But no,
Obama got it before he did anything.
Right, exactly.
That was a gift from the Norwegians.
They've effectively said, yeah, probably not.
Yeah.
But what he's trying to do here, I do think, is bend reality. And he's seen this work for him again and again and again. You have more than half of the Republican Party sort of shrugs off what happened on January 6th or thinks that it was Antifa or thinks that it was the FBI or what have you. He does this, and it works.
Nancy, I want to ask you, in the category of appropriate credit, following the Middle East situation carefully, he did do the thing in Gaza. It's not peace, it's ceasefire. It's very hard to make peace for Israel to make peace with Hamas because Hamas doesn't believe that Israel should exist. It's hard to negotiate your own existence, obviously. But he did achieve something there. He banged Netanyahu's head together with dealing with Qatar and pushed and threatened Hamas. I mean, do you give credit for this or any other?
I mean, it's hard to not give credit given the return of the hostages after 2 years. And I think if you watch those images this week, it was really moving, as well as the return of Palestinian prisoners. However, That was phase 1, and phase 2, 3, 4, 5 are the more complicated in terms of reaching an enduring peace in that region. We still haven't answered the question of what disarming Hamas looks like, who's governing there. And the proof of, I think, how much Hamas is entrenched and still has power is within a day of this. They were executing opposition in Gaza City, Palestinians.
Other Palestinians.
That's right. And so that is not a group that seems to be on its back heels.
And he shrugged that off.
Yes, because
which was very odd.
But until those enduring questions are answered, which in some ways are much more complicated than the initial one, I think it's hard to say that we're on the path to an enduring peace.
Right, and another example would be he claims to have brought peace to Pakistan and India. I don't think anybody at this table would say that, would bet that Pakistan and India are never going to have another armed confrontation again.
No, and actually, I've been really bothered by the coverage of the Middle East story because whatever credit he deserves for putting pressure on Netanyahu, the coverage has been so ecstatic, almost sort of echoing his own rhetoric. It's as if we're influenced by his high opinion of what he's done. And exactly the point that Nancy just made, we haven't talked about who's going to govern Gaza. We haven't talked about what the broader region looks like. I mean, all these unanswered questions that normally they would be that would be the main thing we were discussing, and somehow, as Trump bends the story and he twists it, and here we are talking about the Nobel Prize as if that was what was important. Right. Not peace in Gaza.
It's really interesting you say that because my colleague and I did a story about Jared Kushner, and in the conversation my colleague Katie Rogers had with him, he said we're deals guys, and our job is to get to yes first and figure out the details later. And in fact, that's sort of what happened. He got the hostages out. They got the yes to the release of the hostages, but the details remain exceedingly unclear, and that's the important stuff. That's the hard stuff. That's how you get to some sort of lasting peace, if that's possible.
And the Biden administration got hostages released. It's not like there have been no hostages released in this war.
Right. Let me change the subject. I want to talk to Nancy for a minute about, it's not an unrelated topic, but, presidents from Harry Truman to George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and including Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, have always believed that in a democratic country, there's a role for the press in covering military affairs, matters of war and peace. The Secretary of Defense, the current Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, believes otherwise, it seems, as does his president, presumably. And so the ouster of the Pentagon press corps was just engineered this week. There have been press at the Defense Department for as long as there's been a Defense Department. What was it like to be part of the last week of the Pentagon press corps in the Pentagon, and what does it mean for coverage of these matters of life and death in the future?
I mean, frankly, it was sad. Because the Pentagon is such a hard beat to cover, you often stay in a minimum for 5 years, so many of the
You were there for
18.
18.
And so you had decades and decades and decades of experience walking out the door. These are people that we've gotten to know, and I'm not just talking about the troops and the civilians, but the staff that work there, the people who will never have a story written about them, but are such an intricate part of the running of the Pentagon. And you felt sad as journalistically because I think it's important that we have the ability to ask leaders questions, especially when they're in charge of $1 trillion of taxpayer dollars, and have the tremendous responsibility of deploying as many as too many people into harm's way, in addition to another 1 million civilians. Having said that, I also felt this week a tremendous sense of pride because in the time since we have been evicted, we've had journalists do exceptional coverage just this week, including Tyler, about the Southcom commander being removed, about military lawyers being removed after raising questions, a CNN story. Reuters broke the story that two narco-terrorists who were part of a strike were put onto
alleged narco-terrorists.
That's right.
We have a hard time knowing what's going on.
That's right. Survived a military strike and moved onto a Navy ship. Those are not stories that the Pentagon put out first. Those are stories that journalists put out first. And so in this bid to sort of limit our ability to do our jobs, I think we also saw a press corps this week that continued doing their job.
Yeah. I think it's important to say that the eviction of the press corps from the physical premises doesn't mean that we're stopping to cover. In fact, I've decided to hire more Pentagon press reporters. I want to find more colleagues for Nancy and her colleagues because we have to work harder at this, and I know other organizations are going to double down on uncovering this because that's what happens in a democracy. Let me talk to Tyler just for 1 second about this. You mentioned Southcom. This is the combatant command that runs American operations in the Latin American sphere. Very mysterious, sudden departure of the guy who runs that, four-star admiral, Alvin Halsey. Do we know anything more about why he was removed? This comes obviously at a time when we're blowing up Venezuelan boats.
Yeah, so after we reported this story, the Pentagon announced that he was retiring. But based on the reporting I did with my colleague Eric Schmidt, there's two interesting things here. One is that we know that the admiral had privately raised some concerns about the U.S.'s military operations in Venezuela and in the larger region. This comes as the president has ramped up his sort of bellicose rhetoric about Maduro and Venezuela, and we've seen numerous attacks on ships in the region. The president saying this week he wanted to go on land next. And also, what's noteworthy here is that this is usually a 3-year job, and he left after basically 1. That's not normal. And so the retirement announcement is definitely, there's some questions there about it.
And if I could add quickly, that there was no successor name. This
happened in a rush.
That's right.
Right. Let me talk about one more subject in a very, very busy week. Let's listen to President Trump talk about some of the people he doesn't like very much.
Deranged Jack Smith, in my opinion, is a criminal. And I noticed his interviewer was, I think that was Weissman. And I hope they're going to look into Weissman, too. Weissman's a bad guy. And he had somebody in Lisa, who was his puppet, worked in the office really as the top person. And I think that she should be looked at very strongly. I hope they're looking at Shifty Schiff. I hope they're looking at all these people. And I'm allowed to find out. I'm allowed to, I'm, in theory, the chief law enforcement officer.
Steve, Ann, let me start with you, Ann, and then go to Steve. I'll give him the last word. You cover Eastern European quasi-authoritarian regimes. You've covered authoritarianism around the world. When a leader, a chief executive, deploys prosecutors to go after his political enemies, what do you call that?
I call that not rule of law, meaning the law is what it says it is, but rule by law, meaning the law is what the leader or the political party in charge says it is. In other words, it's an enormous, clear break with an American tradition that goes back many decades.
Have we ever seen this in America? Watergate?
You could find people attempting to do it. You can find it at the state level. I don't think in modern times there's ever been this blatant attempt of the president. By the way, he's not just using prosecutors. He's using the IRS. He's using other kinds of American institutions that are supposed to belong to all of us, that are supposed to be politically neutral. He's using them to investigate, to do kind of fishing expeditions on his various enemies to find out whether they've made a mistake in their mortgage application. I mean, this is stuff that, I hate to make these comparisons. I mean, this is exactly what happened in Putin's Russia in the early 2000s. If Putin wanted to get rid of somebody, he didn't arrest them. That was old-fashioned way of doing it. He would just have a tax investigation.
Steve, I'll give you the last word on this. Is this a crisis in your mind, a democratic crisis in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, for a long time you heard people, including some Republicans, sort of wonder when we'd get to the point where this was an emergency, when this was a crisis. We're here. This is it. He campaigned on retribution. At virtually every one of his public comments, he talks about the people he wants to go after. He's very clear. He names them, as we just saw. There's no question what he's doing here. I think the only question is who and how can we stop him?
And Congress, is it possible that Republicans in Congress would think that's enough?
I mean, you have some of the people in Congress who have said that they wanted to remain, non-Trump people wanted to remain in Congress so that they could be there in a moment like this. We'll see.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank our guests for joining me, and thank you at home for watching us. You can read Nancy's story about the eviction of the press from the Pentagon at theatlantic.com. I'm Jeffrey Goldberg. Good night from Washington.
Corporate funding for Washington Week with The Atlantic is provided by...
In 1995, two friends set out to make wireless coverage accessible to all. With no long-term contracts, nationwide coverage, and 100% U.S.-based customer support. Consumer Cellular. Freedom calls.
Certified financial planner professionals are proud to support Washington Week with The Atlantic. CFP professionals are committed to acting in their clients' best interest. More information at letsmakeaplan.org.
Additional funding is provided by Koo and Patricia Ewan for the Ewan Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose Herschel and Andy Shreves, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, Charles Hamawi through the Charles Hamawi Fund, Steve and Marilyn Kerman, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.